Have Jessica put the picture up of the website just so that if you have, I'm sure all of you have been here before, but if not, it's www.wolfhounds2nd27th.org. And there's Joe kissing a fish lips. But, this website's had over 3.2 million hits, and this is a great resource. Just to remind you, you can go see different things like war stories. You can see lost buddies. You can see the honor roll there. You can contact. You can donate. Several people have used the portal to donate to the Wolfhounds. There's also the Wolfhounds themselves. This is one of the coolest parts of the site. Every Wolfhound that we've encountered or come in contact with should have their name on the site and at least some kind of information that you can get a hold of them. Now, there have been a couple over the years that just said, I don't prefer to be on the site. I don't want people to reach out. We respect that. But most every person, and if your name's not, if you're not on there and you're a Wolfhound, let me know. I think all of you are up to date there. One of the other things that's really cool is if you hit, and for sake of, Jessica doesn't have this ready, but there's Wolfhound Forever interviews. And I want to talk to you just for a minute before you put that slide up, Jessica. I just want to share that over the last several years, we endeavored to do a project where we interviewed our Wolfhound brothers and sisters. And we've had we were just talking about this today at lunch, some of the trips we took and some of the flights and the delays and different things that went on. The Wolfhounds Forever initiative was really birthed out of making sure that oh, that's awesome. Oh, good job, Jessica. Yeah, click on that. Yeah. So this takes you to this page. This should take you to the YouTube page. And so actually what you're seeing, let's stop right there, Jess. Just so you know, every session we did has already been recorded and already on the Wolfhound YouTube page and on Facebook. So we streamed and recorded every session, and they're already up there. So if you wanted to go back, like Gary Hill told me, he called and he says, oh man, I'm watching the memorial service. And that was really cool that he got to do that. So, you have opportunity to click on these. There's Father Jim down there. There's others that we've done over the years. But there's over 100. There's some that, there's Christine, what's her last name? King. She's a PTSD specialist, and we had an interview with her. But I want to tell you, some of you might not realize the impact that this has had. Since we started this several years ago, there have been over 20,000 views on the Wolfhounds Forever YouTube page. Now, I don't know if that means anything to you, but 20,000 different people have clicked on, listened to, heard about, and a lot of those are your family and your friends. So I just want to give you, for example, we did an analytics on this, and I want to give you the top 5 on Wolfhounds Forever. Who's trending right now, top 5? At 631 views, one of our adopted Wolfhounds, Bob Seegers, Cobra pilot. He's in the top 5, 631. Now, I did find out that he took a robotic pen and it every day clicks 5 times, and so I think he's running up his own. 4th place, top views, the bodybuilder of the Wolfhounds, our own beloved long hair surprise back there, Joe Wascom at 684. Yeah. So, number 3, at 739, Jimmy Langley. Jimmy Langley's not with us this time, but he has 739. Number 2, yeah, go ahead. That's fine, honoring him. Number 2, Bill Vaught, probably one of the most incredible interviews we had. We had a 786 views so far from him, and he's passed away. God rest his soul. The number 1 most watched, and I think somebody paid the mafia for clicks on this, but this has to be 795 views, and that's Jerry Tempesta. So To honor Jerry, I'm going to go back in his video and I'm going to make his cell phone ring about every 3 minutes. I think that's karma. I think he's owed that. Yeah. So Bill Vaught, let me go back to him for just a second. We're in Kansas City, and we had just recorded, I believe, John Cook and Nye and a couple other guys came to the church. You remember that? And my dad said, there's some guys in Kansas, Baker and then Cal Johnson, and there was one other one that liked to fish a lot. I can't remember his. Is it Donick? What, the chiropractor? The guy, is that his name? Maybe one of those guys. But he said, but wait, we got to deal with something. He said, something in my heart's telling me we got to go out to Branson, Arkansas. And I said, who's out there? He says, there's Bill Vaught. And I said, isn't Bill sick right now? And he said, yeah, that's why we got to go. He says, I think he's going to die. And so we have our normal way. Usually if we're going somewhere, we call that veteran and we don't tell them we're coming because most of the time the veteran won't let us come. There's some of them that would, but some wouldn't. Jim, you were very kind. You drove all the way to Portland to see us. But there's other guys that if you said we're taping your interview, they just said, there's nothing in my life, nothing special about me, so you have to kind of get in the door to get there. And we called Bill, and he said, oh, yeah, I've got doctor's appointments. And my dad said, we'd like to stop by and say hi. And he said, nope, not going to be a good day for me today. I'm not going to be there. And we had already driven halfway. And so my dad said, keep going. So we Google mapped his house. We found it, and we pulled up, and nobody was there. And we sat for an hour, and nobody showed up. And then we almost started to go home. And we went down to a grocery store and just, tinkered around. And we went back up to the house and knocked on the door. And he had literally just pulled in. He pulled his truck in the garage and shut the door. And he opened the door and he says, hey, I told you today wasn't a good day. And my dad said, oh, well, we were in the area. We were just in the area. And so we have a little thing. Long and short of it was we had a little deal that if we could get the door open, then I just knew, grab the cases, don't say a word, and set it up. So I set Bill up on the back porch, and Bill walked out and sat in that chair, and it was within a few weeks, if I'm not mistaken, that he passed away. And if we wouldn't have gone, Bill's story would have never been told. And I just want every veteran to look at me. I just want you to know your story. It doesn't matter if you don't think it was important, it's your service. And your service matters. I'm not saying it mattered. It matters to this day. My opinion, I'm partial. You are some of the greatest men in the world. You are some of the bravest. And I'm going to tell you another thing. A lot of the guys that we interviewed at Schofield are watching these, and you know what? They think you're the greatest. You know who else thinks you're the greatest? Your wives, your children, your grandchildren. Some people, they don't understand. And listening to Russ Bruns, we had Russ's interview, and then we got to do a podcast, the Wolfhounds podcast, which is something we started a couple years ago. And we actually did a podcast with his wife and got her perspective. And we did one with Becky and got her perspective of what it's like living with a veteran. These are not to embarrass or humiliate, or even your interview. This is completely for honor's sake, for education, to know that you can go on and like Jimmy Langley, for example. He was Tommy Clack's radio guy. And to hear his stories and to hear, and then John's is coming out in the next couple of weeks, which that'll be awesome. It's an honor to provide this and give this to you. Now, I just want to tell you that our goal for the Wolfhounds Forever project, for the website, is that this lives on for the next 100 years. I want my granddaughter Audrey someday to sit down and look at her great papa. This was Jared's dad. I want her to sit down and understand the rich heritage that we come from. Veterans are real men. Veterans are brave. Veterans put one foot in front of the other. Veterans don't quit. And so that's the whole reason why we do what we do. You know, we've had others, like when we met Father Drucker, who's on his phone right now, so help me God, I'm going to beat your phone with your cane. Yeah, you have to. Yeah, he's addicted. So when we met Father Jim, he said, I don't have anything to say. And 2.5 hours later in the first one and 2.5 hours later in the second one, we finally, I actually fainted from dehydration. He talked so much I couldn't. But I think they believe me. They've heard you already. They know. But we got to talk with Scott. You know, Scott's one of our adopted Wolfhounds. And I just want to remind you guys that this reunion, for example, you know, some of the guys didn't come this time, and it doesn't matter why they didn't come. Some of them had graduations, we understand. Some of them had medical situations, we understand. But you came. And we made a promise a couple years ago. I don't know if you remember, we said, as long as you keep coming, we'll keep coming. I made a promise that as long as you show up, I'll show up. Now, it looks different this time. I know some of you criticized me. I didn't have the semi-truck full of gear. I'm just kidding. That was a joke. But, you know, a lot of work. But if we needed it, I'll bring it. If we need multiple screens, I'll bring them. But whatever we need, we'll keep it simple. And we'll just keep having the reunions every year. I think Sarah and I had talked. And Sarah, I'm going to ask you to come forward for just a minute. And I just want to give you some of the whys. Over the years, you know, there was some comments made that maybe we should go to a different location. I just want Sarah to speak to that for just a couple minutes, because I think it's important that you understand why we have stayed here, why we stayed in Branson, then why did we stay here? And I want you to share about that, and as we're looking. We do like it, but some folks have expressed like, hey, why don't we change it up? And I just want her to speak to that.
The selection of a reunion location is more than just what there is to do around the location. Back when, some of you will remember, we did the motorcycle ride with Jim Marshall, and we went down to Branson, Arkansas. That's called Eureka Springs. As we pulled out, I looked over my shoulder, and Tommy Clack was left behind. That's not right. I told myself that wouldn't happen again. At the next reunion, I called up a Navy buddy of mine who had a sidecar. And he had put a tarp over his beautiful white Harley. And the tarp was red, and it rained on it, and it turned his Harley pink. I called Al, and I said, buddy, you got to go get that sidecar repainted, because Captain Clack's not riding in a pink sidecar. Al went and had his sidecar and his motorcycle repainted, and then at the next reunion, Tommy Clack took his first motorcycle ride down to Bill Vaught's. When I go to select a location, a property, a resort, a hotel, number one, they got to have a shuttle that is wheelchair accessible from the airport. COVID almost wiped out, I would say, at least 50% of hotels with shuttles, because those shuttles were sitting there and they were costing them insurance, they were costing them upkeep, and they weren't running. Second thing they have to have is a handicap accessible room that can meet any possible need that any of you could possibly have. If they don't have what I would consider enough handicap accessible rooms for the size of the property, we have to turn it down. They have to have a restaurant on site. In Branson alone, the Radisson has been bought by a timeshare company, took out the restaurant. The Grand Plaza, where you were the first time you came to Branson, is now closed. It is in disrepair. They are looking for an owner. But before they closed, the first thing they did was they closed their restaurant and didn't reopen it after COVID. How many groups do you think they lost because they didn't have a restaurant to serve breakfast on site? And guys, I'm not talking about having half-warm oatmeal and a couple of muffins and a few bananas and apples. I want you guys to have a breakfast choice like we have here. Another thing I look at, of course, is the rate. Right here on this property, we are on tribal land. The tax rate for your room is 6%. If we were in Branson today, the tax on your room would be 12.35% per day. If we were in Nashville, Tennessee, it would be 18%. If we were in Bremerton, Washington, it would be almost 20% per day. I try to take these things into consideration. So, yes, we may have stayed here too long. I'm in agreement with that. But when I go to look for another property, what I have to do is to meet or exceed your expectations of what we've received here. This property, because of our relationship that started out with Bob and the general manager here, gives us active duty government per diem rate. We will not get that anyplace else because none of you are still active duty. Okay, so when we go to look at another location, I just wanted to give you a heads up. We are probably looking at a group rate this time of year, June, July, between $146 and $169 per night for a room that's going to be close to what you have right now. That is another reason we haven't moved, is because we can get a great rate, an incredible tribal tax, a shuttle, food options, and you never have to leave the casino if you don't want to. So when we go to pick a new location, keep in mind that this is what I'm looking for, and we may not find a perfect fit. Not every place is a perfect fit in a new location, but I will strive to do my best to live up to the expectations of what we had here in cleanliness, service, and rate.
Thank you, Sarah. So, Jessica, if you'll put the email address back on the screen, timothyquintrell@gmail.com. If you want to say, here's 3 things I want. What did we do? What have we done good at the reunions in the past several years? Number 2, what could we do better? And if you have an idea about a location, send it in the email, okay? Because we'd love your feedback. And just a disclaimer on what we could do better, nobody has to mention the speech, okay? You don't have to mention it. We all know, okay? So we don't even want to say that because I think that'll hurt his feelings. So, couple things. I'm going to ask for a microphone to be taken to Bob Seegers. And Bob, I'm going to have you stand up. Bob and I had a conversation a couple days ago. And Bob didn't know this was going to happen, and so I was like, thanks for the softball. Bob said to me, do you, as the guy who's helping put these on, do you actually understand the impact that these reunions have? And I said, well, I think I do. And he said, let me tell you a story about another Cobra pilot. And so, Bob, is it okay? Would you share that impact about Busey and just summarize what we talked about the impact it had on his life coming to the reunion?
Yes, I'd be glad to. As you all know, Greg Busey passed away a year and a half ago, and we both got in Vietnam the same month, August of 1968. We both flew Cobras, were there, and we saw basically the same activities, combat. But unfortunately, he suffered from some severe PTSD, I'm sorry. And at my second reunion in Branson, his wife Debbie came up to me and asked me how come he suffered from PTSD and I didn't when we actually were involved in the same thing. I really didn't have an answer for her. But then one of the last things that we did at the reunion, we had the three pilots, Chuck Moore, Greg Busey, and myself up front, and everybody could ask us questions. I think one of the best questions I've ever been asked about my service in Vietnam was Tim, when he asked if we had any regrets. Well, when I heard Greg Busey's answer, I knew exactly the cause of his PTSD. What he said was that he developed a bloodlust in Vietnam. To me, that was no big deal because I did too. But if you understand Greg's upbringing, his father was a doctor, his mother a nurse. Greg always believed when he grew up he was going to be a doctor himself. And if you know the Hippocratic Oath, I guess something to the effect of first, do no harm. Also, Greg was very religious. And he told me once that because of that bloodlust he developed in Vietnam, he knew he was going to hell, and it bothered him. And he suffered from PTSD really badly because all he believed he did in Vietnam was take lives. But at that first reunion, he realized for the very first time that he really didn't take lives, he saved lives. And what really struck him was in the second reunion when at the end you had pictures of family members, wives, children, and grandchildren. And Greg realized at that point in time that he did not take lives, but he saved lives. And he had weekly PTSD meetings. And after that first reunion in Branson, he went home. He actually drove me to the airport, and that guy was on a high like you have never seen. He, for the first time in his life, was excited and proud of his Vietnam service. And that's due to the Wolfhounds. So he, unfortunately, did pass away prematurely, but I can tell you he went to God in peace. So I personally want to thank all of you Wolfhounds because you made his life worthwhile the last 4 years of his life. And so for the...
Thank you, Bob. Can you take the mic to Becky Bruns for me? Becky Bruns? Becky, I'm going to ask you to stand up. Would you tell us what the impact of the reunions have had on your family?
Jessica, I cry a lot too. It's just opened a lot of doors that were non-openable before. I think there's a greater understanding from the kids especially why some of the things happen with their raising. You know, Dad wasn't just a hard case because that's how he was. It was who he was because of the war and the situations there. And a lot of it was the post-traumatic stress that was deep down, but it was just part of him. And it was for their safety, for their well-being, you know, all the other reasons that were deep down. And when you're asked to do something, it's you do it and you ask how high to jump on the way up. You know, and it wasn't because he was hard-hearted, because he wasn't that way before, because we were married just a few months before he was drafted. So, you know, we were just kids. And that impact just totally changed him. But, you know, now there's a deep understanding of why, and a healing for him as well, to a point, but those things are in his psyche, and it's just, that's what we learn to roll with. So, you know, there's those kind of things, but yeah, and the deeper respect and love and sacrifice. And then as a group, overall, the thorough understanding and love and acceptance is what it's, I kind of think that's where that's at. So thank you guys. for the openness and the love and the family, and knowing that there's others that have overcome, suffered, shared all of those moments together, because it truly is a brotherhood and a sisterhood for us ladies that have been through the other side of it and the war that's there also. So thank you, everybody.
You bet. Yeah. And it's probably been hard. I think Russell's very hard to get along with. You can tell, very difficult. Can you hand that to Chuck Moore? Russell, have you forgiven my dad for the stunt he pulled in Branson with the glass eye, the floating eye? Did you ever forgive him for that? Russell, I'm talking to you, you deaf old buzzard. Just sit down. Chuck Moore, I'm going to have you stand up, sir. Would you share with us for a few minutes about the impact? You come all the way from Alaska to be here. And I've watched you personally. A man that when I first met you, you were pretty reserved, pretty quiet. And but Chuck, tell us what impact this has had on you and Faye and your family, these reunions.
Well, I come for Faye because she seems to enjoy these things.
What a cop-out.
Well, and I'm glad my daughter got to come last year. A buddy of mine up in Alaska, another helicopter pilot, Vietnam guy, lives next door, told me once that you can count your best friends on one hand. That used to be true. And now I don't have enough hands.
Well said, Chuck. So, Chuck, can you hand the mic to Laura Ann, Big John's better half, prettier half, more mentally stable half, more emotionally solid half? All of the above. Laura, tell us the impact the reunions have had on you. You've this is your 11th reunion, and you've been there from the beginning. What impact has this had on your life?
Well, it's made me less shy to be around people, and I just love being with the Wolfhounds and the stories and the laughter and the crying, because we get sad about some of these things, and I just love watching him up there on the stage and really putting his heart out to everybody. So that's about it.
You're the only one that cried during the speech, and I figured out that it was because you were so proud of him, I guess.
I have to share something too that a lot of people don't know about my wife. Since the very beginning, my wife's been the one that has created all of the name tags, all of the stuff on the table. Every year she does this. And you know what? It's a lot of work. She does all this by herself. And I love you so much anyway, but I love you more for her.
Okay, last one. We're going to go to Becky Dasher. Becky Dasher. Now, we've chastened Becky. Yeah, I was going to say, you better step up. This is your opportunity, Becky. Becky, tell us what the impact of these reunions and reconnecting with the veterans has meant to you.
I always say, and I have said, every reunion that we've been to, and we've been to 10, and when we come back here, and we're with your people, I have my husband back. For some of you that don't know, I was that Army brat that just had to marry that GI. So I've been with the military ever since I was 3 years old. And I know that there's some women in this group right now, and some women, some of the men, that if I have a problem or something, no matter what time, day or night, I can pick up the phone, text them, call them. They know about. So I heard someone say the other day, don't talk to her because all she's going to talk about is that grandbaby. Oh, you're so right. Yeah. You're so right. Because he is a world. But laying all jokes aside, Larry Dasher is my world. And his mother always told me, if you do it for him one time, you're going to have to do it for him for life. So that's why he gets his supper in his recliner every night, or his breakfast in his recliner every morning. So
This isn't a confessional.
But that's it, you know. So I just want you to know that every man, the women are important to me too, but every one of you have a special place in my heart that's in this room right now.
So at your tables, you guys every one of you should have a little Tropic Lightning sticker on the table. It's a small sticker, and that is for you. That has a little scan on it, just to remind you. You can put that on your phone, your cup. You can put it somewhere that you'll remember, and it's an opportunity for you to not have to say www.wolfhound2nd27th.org. That little scan right there, anyone with their phone can zoom in on it and go right to the Wolfhounds website, and you can point them and let them hear for themselves what an awesome family you have in the Wolfhounds. So that's what that sticker's for. Make sure you peel it and put it somewhere. If you don't have a sticker, we put them on the tables, and if someone doesn't have one, that's fine. We'll get you one. So we're just going to keep trucking right now. We got one final segment, and that's with Cy Krevling. Give Cy a hand as he comes, and we're going to talk through some D-Day stuff. What I meant to say was Cy Krevling's coming. Why don't you give him a big hand as he comes to talk about some D-Day stuff. You want the chair? Are you good?
No, I'm gonna stand up here, but if we could have a microphone runner to the people, because this is going to be an audience participation thing. That's the reason I asked you to be thinking about your family and neighbors that were in World War II. Last week, it's exactly a week from today, a week ago today, was the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And all of us who are in our mid to late 70s grew up with parents who were affected by World War II. They'd gone through the Great Depression, and then their reward for getting through that was to fight a war that was literally worldwide. And so I grew up talking to these mostly men, but there were women too, and to see what their lives were like. And I'll tell you about a few of them, then we're going to go around the room and consider that there are people that participated that weren't in uniform. Women who went and built B-24 Liberators, people who worked in coal mines, people who were doing agriculture. You know, we still needed to eat on the home front, but and everybody who was in uniform wasn't in combat, because it turns out there's an expression that amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. And if you look at the amount of logistics it took in World War II, it's just flabbergasting how much material was being moved around the world. And what makes it even more impressive to me is there were no computers. They were doing all this with slide rules and with counting on their fingers or something. But among the people that I knew growing up was a neighbor up the street, Max Smith. He was a plasterer. He grew up in Orange, Virginia, got drafted. He was in the 29th Infantry Division. The 29th Infantry Division was one of the divisions that hit Omaha Beach on the first day, in D-Day. Max was carrying a Browning automatic rifle, and he described to me fighting in the hedgerows at night in France, and this Browning BAR, which would fire, and he'd be going boom, 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 firing. And he said the Germans had a machine gun that sounded like ripping canvas, like, and it would lay down a sheet of phosphorescence across these hedgerows. And he said it was incredibly dispiriting to see this, because he's going boom, 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 and they're just firing back 10 bullets for every one that he's firing. Max Weeks, I knew him as a kid. I did not realize until I read his obituary somewhat recently. I looked him up. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, where he was wounded. Not only was he wounded, but he was captured. So here it is, the January of 1945. It's freezing cold, and you're wounded. You've been taken by the Germans, who can barely feed themselves, and so they weren't feeding prisoners. Just imagine what a kind of a life this guy had. 10 years ago, my mother passed away, and her best friend was at the funeral, and I'd known her since literally before I was born. They were friends when my mom was pregnant, Elva Castile. And she said something to me that I'd heard the expression, but nobody had ever said it to me. She said, "Thank you for your service." And I was kind of surprised, because Elva was an Army nurse. She was based in England, and the day after D-Day, she was in a medical C-47 Skytrain, and they were flying across the English Channel, landing on farm roads in Normandy that had been cleared of trees on the side of the road, and had hand-painted numbers painted on the road so they could identify which airfield, at which point they were at. They would pick up wounded soldiers and bring them back to England, and they shuttled back and forth until it got dark every day. They did this for several weeks until the U.S. had pushed far enough into France to set up bigger hospitals in France. And in those 2 weeks, the nursing crews finished the day. They were exhausted, and they were just drenched in human blood. And this woman thanked me for my service, and it was kind of an awkward moment for me, because I knew what she had done. The other person who was involved in D-Day was Ari Hill's father. Ari Hill's father had what I thought was possibly the worst job in the United States Army at that time. I met him 10 years or so ago when an honor flight brought him into Washington, D.C. Ari brought his dad in. They flew in and for the dedication of the World War II Memorial on the Mall. And what did he do? He hit Omaha Beach the day after D-Day. He was with a Graves registration unit. That meant all those bodies that you saw rolling in the surf, all the people that had been blown up, they're trying to identify them, pull them in, to be able to tell someone that they'd lost their son, their father, their brother. My next door neighbor behind me was a guy named Phil Enterline. He was a tech sergeant who was assigned on a B-17 crew, and he manned a Norden bomb site, which was something the Allies had turned out to be a failed project, but he was good enough at doing certain skills that he got assigned to a special unit. And that's, the Germans had built some incredibly hardened missile launching sites on the French coast. And somewhere over 20 feet of reinforced concrete protected these sites from bombing. There was no bombs in the U.S. arsenal big enough to handle those. And so they came up with an idea that they would take B-17s and strip them of guns, strip them of any armament, take everything, all the bomb racks out of them, take every seat out of it except the pilot seat, and loaded this plane with a compound called nitrostarch, which is similar to nitroglycerin. And they loaded these planes up with this, and two people took off in the plane, and when it got up to altitude, a fighter plane was flying overhead, and they'd set up a crude remote control system. So the fighter plane would take over control of the B-17, and the pilot and Phil would parachute out, hopefully over land, in the English Channel if not, and then they were going to fly it straight into a glide path that put it right down the mouth of this bunker. The project ended up didn't go very well, and by the time they got all the kinks worked out of it, the U.S. had actually surrounded these hard spots, and the Germans couldn't get in or out at that point, so there was no problem. But the danger was, of course, that you've got tons of a very volatile explosive, and you're in an airplane, and if you recall, another guy who was in this unit, there was a Navy component to it too, was John Kennedy's older brother, who was killed when his plane exploded, and took him. So dangerous job. Guy never talked about it. Now I want to open this up to other people. And it can be as simple as, hey, I had a neighbor who was, on a freighter that was torpedoed in the Mediterranean or anything, and that's all you remember about it. But if we start out, Jim, why don't you tell us what your dad did?
My dad was in submarines during World War II. He was a torpedo officer on a boat called the Jack. They called them boats, the submarines. He went to the Naval Academy, class of 43, but they actually graduated early in 42. He was starting in a private college, Oberlin, but he ran out of money, so he went to the Naval Academy. And he wanted to be a pilot, actually, but he was too tall. He's almost 6'4", and at that time you couldn't do that. So he wound up in submarines. He was a torpedo officer. And the Jack had a good record, 29 merchant ships and 1 destroyer. So they had a pretty good run against the Japanese. He wrote a book called Silent Running that's done real well. The book's done real well. It's an excellent book. You might enjoy reading it. It talks about his girlfriend in Australia, too, which was, since he was married to my mother at the time, it's sort of a little tense, but it was okay. Those guys really, a lot of the boats were lost. He was depth charged many times, and had his submarine damaged. He was very heavily decorated. He had several Silver Stars and Silver Stars, and the Navy Cross. After the war, he wanted to go to medical school, but again, he didn't feel like he had enough money. So I had to fulfill his dream of going to medical school, I guess. But anyway, he stayed in submarines, and he was on a diesel boat for a little while called the Trigger. But he got very close with Admiral Rickover, from the the guy who started the nuclear navy. And actually, when I was little, then I was pretty young. I must have been 10 or so. We used to often go to Rickover's house for dinner, and so I spent a lot of time with him. And he was a very amazing man. Many things about Admiral Rickover were quite remarkable. But he was also one of the very first Jews who got to admiral rank, star rank in the Navy. A very, very amazing person, but he was determined to get the nuclear Navy going. Since then, there have been over 200 nuclear subs built, but my dad had the third sub. The first sub was called the Nautilus. The second sub was called the Seawolf, which never really worked. That was a sodium cooled, that plant never worked. But his sub, the Skate, was a very successful sub. It was a killer type sub. And the thing that he did that was really unusual was he was the first person to surface at the pole. So he was the skipper then of that boat. He was the torpedo officer during the war, but on the Skate he was the skipper. And he went up under the North Pole. First he made one run under the North Pole, just went under the ice and came back. But the second run was during the winter, and he surfaced right exactly at the North Pole. They have these things, areas where the ice is thin. It's called polynyas. It's thin. It's like about 3 feet deep. But he was able to come up from below. They didn't have any of the gadgets, that we have now. So he had to actually figure out by watching the jellyfish in the water how fast they were going up and down. But he managed to break through and got the sub totally through the ice so that the whole sub was there. He got out. National Geographic actually gave him some cameras, so he got some pretty amazing pictures of that. But it was important because the idea was once they had the missile boats, then they could potentially launch missiles from that. So that was a big change in our life because he became quite well known after that. Got the Legion of Honor from France, and he wrote a best-selling book. And so he was quite a remarkable man. Towards the end of his career, he was superintendent of the Naval Academy. He was a 3-star then, and that was a good career for him. I think he was always crushed that he never got to be Chief of Naval Operations, but because Zumwalt was more, at that time, remember Zumwalt, he kind of aced my dad out from getting to be CNO, but he did like being at the Naval Academy. Recently, at the Naval Academy, there's this rule now that, or a law or a regulation or something, that everything that's named after a Civil War general has to be changed. The name has to be changed. So the street that he lived in, or we lived in, there in Annapolis at the Naval Academy was called Buchanan Street. I guess Buchanan was a Confederate general. I don't really remember that part. But anyway, they decided to change the name of the road to Calvert Road. So if you go to the Naval Academy, you'll see a Calvert Road there that's named after him. It's pretty cool. I have a picture I could show you of myself and my stepbrothers. My stepbrothers were really grew up in the house there in the Naval Academy. I wasn't there. I just came there. When I came back from Vietnam, I went there for a month or two, but mostly I never really lived there. But, so he was quite a man, and I think he and I didn't always get along. We had a lot of times when we were definitely not getting along. I didn't want to go to Vietnam, actually, and he kind of talked me into it, which I've never regretted. It was, actually, Vietnam was, in some ways, it was among the happiest time of my life when I was there. I felt like I was really doing something very worthwhile for the first time ever in my life. Not that I believed in the war particularly, but taking care of the people really meant a lot to me. And so I think more and more, I think about my dad. I feel better about him and who he was as a person. Like I said, we had our disagreements, but he was a very, very brave man. He was fearless. Nothing scared him, obviously, but by a number of things he did in his life. So basically, I'm really very proud of him. And it was I guess I don't have anything else to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. By the way, I did read that book, and what was impressive about it was the amount of autonomy that the submarine commanders were given in World War II. Jim's dad picked up a ship, or the boat that he was going to be in New Groton, Connecticut, and they did sea trials going down the Atlantic coast, went through the Panama Canal, got to Pearl Harbor, loaded up on torpedoes and fuel, and they weren't allowed to open their orders until they cleared the harbor, because they didn't want to. There were spies. They didn't want the information to get out, and his father described the CO as they cleared Pearl Harbor, opening the orders, and there were 2 words on the orders of the area that they were supposed to patrol, and it said Tokyo Bay. And one thing that surprised me is when he said 29 merchant ships and one destroyer, they were told they weren't looking for carriers, they weren't looking for battleships, they weren't looking for warships of any kind. They were looking for oil tankers, because the Japanese had very little fuel. There's none available in Japan, and so they felt that they could cripple them that way. John, do you want to? I'll bring you a microphone. Do you want to talk about your dad or your family?
I'm sorry I don't know all the fundamental. I didn't know Si was going to do something like this, but I was fortunate enough to have a wonderful man, a stepdad, that served in World War II. He was seaman first class. He was on several ships, but the remarkable part that I always liked about it, or not liked but appreciated, he had 3 of them shot out from under him, you know, and they'd rescue them and go on another one. Like I said, I would know the names if I'd known we, was going to do this, but they would put him on another ship and be damned if it wouldn't get you blown up out from under him again. But in the 2 years, he didn't get to go in. He was young enough that he had to wait. He was 43 before he got in to the war. And but in that time until it quit, he was in the Pacific area. Like I said, he got 3 of the ships shot out from under him. And I thought that was always a big deal, to me. And he was a fabulous man. He came into my life when I was 15. He was a 40-year-old single man, never been married before. Married my mom with 3 grown kids. And to my children, and even Whitney had the blessing to meet him. He and then, like I said, I would have checked into stuff, so I'm sorry, but Whitney's grandfather, the bad part of World War II that I find is the gentleman, the men didn't talk too much about it unless, you grew up in it, But her grandfather, he was in World War II, Vietnam and Korea. He was a 30-year man, and he ended up being he was in the Air Force, and he ended up an E8, so he had done fairly well, but as far as what he done, my mind just don't work that good anymore. And I was also lucky enough, we had our hometown baker was a cook on the Arizona when it got sunk in Hawaii. He was on the boat, so there was some write-ups there at home, in my lifetime about Mr. Cosby. And then these are only, like I said, the World War II. I found we didn't get much.
Have you got somebody?
Well, we didn't have no reason to talk about it, you know. But and then another part, I met this man long before I met Whitney's father, Whitney's mother. Sorry. Yeah. Well, whatever. Yeah, that's what I've always been told. But anyway, was Dick Rice. He was a good man. I was a farmer, and I first met the gentleman. He was a crop duster after, you know, he come home. But he'd done many missions as a B-17 pilot. He'd been over Germany, you know, many times. I think Dad and him were really good friends. And but again, I don't know about how many times he was shot down or if he was, but I know he was a B-17 pilot. But that's really only ones I can think of that I know. But I was lucky enough to know all of these gentlemen, and they all were, you know, I thought very, I don't know.
Well, they kept us from having to learn how to speak Japanese, for one thing, you know.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You know, they were very honorable and brave, because from what few stories my stepdad would talk about, you know, on his, when he was on the water, you know, some of those battles were, especially when the kamikazes started, you know, when they started trying to sink the ships, you know, it said they get pretty hairy.
They were the suicide pilots who were basically flying bombs into ships. And by the way, they had no landing gear. They took off on a dolly, in effect. They didn't want them coming back. You had to deliver your bomb.
Well, they'd even fly the plane into the ship.
Yeah, they flew the whole plane into the ship. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I wished I'd have known more. If I'd have known more, I'd have.
Quite all right.
studied
No,
a
you
little
did.
bit
You
more.
did good, John. You did good. Howard.
My father was at MIT and was smart enough to be helping with the radar systems and reducing the size of the radar systems. He never really talked too much about it, but my uncle was a ball turret gunner in a B-17. And I don't know if you know anything about the worst position to be in a B-17, but the ball turret gunner, because if the B-17 got shot up or the electrical systems were off, you couldn't get the ball turret gunner out. It had to be a functioning electrical system. And all I remember was that this guy had the best attitude I've ever seen in my entire life. He would go, "Hey, pard," and he lived in Delaware and just was a really interesting person. You know, and he has problems with alcohol, but other than that, just was a really interesting guy, and never talked about the war one iota. Just basically always had a really good attitude and was really positive.
Thank you. And point out that the problem with it, you couldn't get the ball turret gunner out, is if the landing gear was shot up, it was going to be a belly landing. That meant the guy was going to die.
My dad was a German POW, and he was in the Polish reserves when the Germans invaded Poland. And he mentioned at one point that he had something to do with communications. However, I think he spent more time in the concentration camps more than he did as service to his country. So he didn't talk about it a whole lot, but he did mention a couple of stories I'll share with you. And that is one, when he's in the compound, they would move the prisoners from one side of the compound to the other every morning. And if anyone was too ill or unable to do that, they were just executed immediately. And so there was a couple other soldiers with him that grabbed him by his breeches and moved him over to the other side of the compound, so he survived that. And the other story that he told was when one of the soldiers wanted to leave. Now, you have to understand that they're malnourished. My dad was about my height and weight, and he was down to near 100 pounds. And so when they decided which soldier had the courage to want and desire to leave there, what they would do is the other soldiers would share their rations with him so that individual could gain strength to make the escape. And also, some of the Polish soldiers would coach them in German, just enough German for them to be able to get out of there. And so what would happen is when the soldier was ready and they decided, well, this is the time to go, then they would, at that time, the Germans needed their soldiers up in the front line, so they rotated some into the compound, and the others would go out to fight the battle. But so they had a constant rotation, so there was new guards coming in all the time. So what the Polish soldiers would do would knock the guard in the head, take his uniform, put it on a POW, and then put the clothes from the POW on the soldier. And then in the morning, the POWs would bury that soldier, and the Polish soldier would escape. And so from my experience with PTSD, it helped me understand my father a little bit better. He was hard. He was hard and tough. And I think he wanted to convey that to me so I could leave my life being, be able to overcome, difficulties. And he wasn't really mean, but he was really stern. And the other thing that I learned from him, I think that was very important, was when you're having a miserable day, and most of us probably have experienced maybe more than one of those, but tomorrow is a new day and a new way to, go forward with your life.
Thank you. Gene, no, want to pass? And by the way, how gutty is it of Larry to come here in his pajama tops tonight?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, Daddy was in World War II. Yeah, my daddy was in World War II. He's a radio gun operator on B-17. They flew 17 missions, and on the 17th mission, on the way back in, they got hit. Well, they bailed out over England at Dartmouth. It's a preserved area in England now. You can build nothing on it and do nothing on it. You can visit. It's got to stay just like it is. Well, while he was in the hospital, the bullet went in, pierced the bottom of his heart, hit his parachute strap, went down, lodged by his spine. Well, they called the chaplain in, the priest, give Daddy his last rites. Daddy was lying on the table when the priest was doing all his good stuff. Daddy woke up and said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Okay." Well, shortly after that, Clark Gable, the famous man, came in and pinned the Purple Heart on him. Wow. I didn't know all this because Daddy was quiet. Me and Daddy didn't see eye to eye for a long time. The only time we seen eye to eye was when I went to Vietnam. He figured I wouldn't come back probably, but I showed him different. Then when I retired, that's when we really got together, when I retired out of the Army. It was all something to click. But I didn't know what all he suffered with. Because he became a minister, he kept all that stuff in. But he could counsel people and tell them what to do. He counseled me a lot with a stick. But I was sort of proud of it. And after he died, we were down in what we called the old kitchen. But Daddy made a study out of it, a junk room you couldn't get into. We were going through his stuff after he died, and he had a picture of Clark Gable and all them movie stars or whatever they were. And Clark Gable putting the Purple Heart on him. And a bunch of movie stars back then went overseas, and they all hugged up to him there in the hospital. I didn't know all that until after he died. You know, it's amazing what you learn when somebody dies, you know. And I don't know what they're going to learn about me, but they had to dig up a grave and find out. But other than that, you know, I respect the World War II veterans because they went through a lot. Thank you much.
Certainly did. Thank you. Thanks. Russ, you want to hold? Anybody here?
Not much about my dad, I really don't.
Okay, you want to pass? Okay. Who we got? Bob? Okay.
My dad was in Second World War, but he was an MP, and he got real rough duty. He was an MP in Hawaii.
Are you good with something? Do you
But
have
he
a story?
did stay in there
Or do
till
you
it
want
was
to
over
pass? It's up
with.
to you.
While he was serving, what's real interesting is my mother worked for Studebakers at that time, and they retooled the foundry in South Bend, and they started making engines for the B-17, and they would turn out, I've forgotten now, but it was a big number every day. So Dad was over there on the beaches, and Mom was in the foundry. Doesn't seem right, does it?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, my daddy was a little different situation. He was born in 1904, and he died in 1966, and he was too young for World War I and too old for World War II. And my uncles told me
Do you have a
that
story?
he had a lot of girlfriends in between there. Said he, I probably got a bunch of half brothers and sisters I don't know about. But anyway, my mother remarried, and she married a veteran that was in the infantry in France in World War II, and was a great guy. And I liked him as much as I did my real daddy. And he used to tell me about, you know, all the battles he was in and everything. But the one story I really want to lay on y'all, a good friend of mine named Pat Ireland, he's dead now. He was a real estate guy, appraiser in Christiansburg, West Virginia. And this woman, her husband just had died, and she was going to have to sell her house, and she didn't have any money, and she said, my husband brought back this streamer from World War II. If you would take that for the payment to get my house appraised, I can get it appraised and sell it and, you know, go on. Well, anyway, she got to telling Pat about this streamer he had. It was in March of 1944. It was in Hitler's headquarters, and it was 4 foot wide, 24 foot long. If y'all ever seen any pictures of Hitler, you've seen these streamers hanging down in Berlin and probably all those places. Well, anyway, Pat gave me the flag, and it had a swastika this big right in the middle of it. I mean, it was a beautiful thing. Well, I had it in my safe for about 15 years, and I couldn't show it to nobody because I owned 11 ARs at the time. I mean, I love AR-15s and M16s. So I got hooked up with a guy named Jerry Krause with the NRA, and he invited me up there to the R.E. Peterson Gallery when they designated that, a whole gallery in the NRA building in Washington, D.C. And I told him I had some stuff I'd like to give to the NRA and put on display. And if any of y'all ever been in the NRA building up there, they've got a segment of every war that the United States fought. Well, anyway, I gave him this flag, and he put it in a World War II exhibit. And if you ever go up there, you'll see it. It's in the background. They sent me pictures of it. And this way, millions of people can see it. So if you ever get a chance to go up there, I'm sure you appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you, thank you. Is that the one southwest of, or southeast of Atlanta? Not. Yeah, yeah. Right.
My father's brother was an artillery officer in the Korean War. And I guess if you know anything about the Korean War, the Chinese, they just almost like the Japanese banzai attacks in World War II. They just kept on coming. And because he had, I guess, thought he had killed so many human beings, he later took his life, which is unfortunate. But the reason I became a pilot is because of my father. During the war, he was a bomber pilot. He flew B-17s, the B-24s, and then the last year of the war, he flew the B-29s. Now, if you want to hear a scary story, he was, well, many of you don't know, there were 2 squadrons of specially modified B-29s that was designed to carry the atomic bomb. Now, at the time, the physicists, they just didn't know how big the bomb would go off. They thought that it could be a dud up to catching the world's atmosphere on fire. Well, he was there at the first atomic bomb. They had a number of the pilots there to watch it. Anyway, the first squadron, it was commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets in the Enola Gay, and they dropped the first 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Well, his squadron was training to go over and carpet bomb Japan with these big bombs. So that was a scary thought, but at the time, they didn't know what was going on. He retired after 32 years in the Air Force. He had 4 children. He liked to call us the 4 T's, depending on where we were born. I'm Tampa. I got a sister, Tennessee, a brother, Texas, and a brother, Tokyo.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah. And by the way, when they were planning these atomic bomb missions, the Japanese were so low on aviation fuel that they were not sending fighter planes up to defend the homeland against single planes, which is reconnaissance planes generally. And that's how the Enola Gay and Boxcar managed to just came in unopposed. And the statistic that just stunned me was, and when I talked about logistics, is in Japan at the end of the war, they had less than 50,000 gallons of aviation fuel. On the island of Tinian, which was one of the islands that they'd taken by amphibious landings to build an airstrip on for the B-29s, the island of Tinian's the size of Manhattan, and they had 8 million gallons of aviation fuel. So we were overwhelming them like that. Where are we at? You got something?
Let me get up first.
Please know how proud I am to be here with you. I'm 82 years old. My oldest brother, Joseph, if he were living, would be 104. Second World War, he was a togelier, a different shooting position on the Flying Fortress. I've researched his life. I was 3 years old when he died, 1 year old when he left, 1945 March. He was with Great Ashfield, which is Bury St. Edmunds. He married a girl from California. He was Catholic. He married an Episcopal girl. I'm joking a little bit, but he died over there, not in action, but he had flown missions. And my mom was given the opportunity, you may not know this, to bring his body back, but my next oldest brother, Paul Drucker, became the 3rd man on the totem pole electric boat company. Groton was the president, vice president, and chief of manpower. I never knew this. I just knew he worked there. And after I got out during my 6 months of intensified training at Jackson, I went to work there, Fort Jackson, at Electric Boat in a new plant. They bought General Steel plant and made it into Electric Boat General Dynamics. And he insisted my mom, Margaret, Gold Star mother, to leave him there in England with his comrades. I'm the only one in our whole family that was blessed to go there to be at his gravesite. I happened at the time, ironically, and it's a beautiful story. I joined the Air Force. I was in the Army. I became a captain. He was a tech sergeant. I'm not talking rank. I'm talking that it's cute. So when I got to Cambridge, which is really Mattingly Cemetery, but it's in Cambridge, England, I had mass for him at the chapel, and I walked the tarmacs. I was the chaplain at Lakenheath for 2 months TDY, which I wanted and got while I was a pastor near Westover when I was commissioned as an officer, as an Air Force chaplain. And it was a moving thing for me to not be at his grave only, which was extremely moving. And the head of the cemetery was a Sergeant Major American, French background. And I asked him, all the people on the plane when I went over for TDY, I said, why don't you take your cross and put it in your brother's grave? I said, well, it's beautiful. So I asked the Sergeant Major, and he said, absolutely, you're a chaplain, it's a wonderful story. But he said, dig it deep. The cemetery was immaculate, absolutely immaculate. And I was so proud. But then a few days later, a wonderful Englishman, a judge who was at the Lakenheath Chapel, Catholic fella, he took me over to the tarmacs. It was like 12 o'clock high, and I really cried. I went into the Hunsick huts, and in there, my brother was 385th Bombardment Group, 551st Bombardment Squadron, and it was all faded. It was really like a movie, a surreal, and blue. They were coded by color. 551st was blue, and so and so and so. All 8th Air Force, of course. And I cried there more, knowing that's where the planes took off, that my brother Joseph was performing his duties. So I'm very proud of my family. And my brother Paul, as I said, became executive with Electric Boat. And his story is also marvelous because he was in 2 subs, talking about our submarines and the Admiral. He was on the Trutta and the Corsair. One was blown up. Paul lived, Edward Drucker, and he saved 7 men's lives because he swam like a fish. Now, I live with my mom, of course, but occasionally I would go to Groton and live with him. And I would see these men at age 14 come and visit him, paying him homage, small h, and I never understood it. And he would also have terrible malaria. He would just shake. I never understood that. But I later realized all of the truths that he had malaria. He served our country faithfully and well. And these men came to thank him for saving their lives. So may God bless all our veterans. And thank you for allowing me to be here. And John, thank you.
I know we're all probably about ready, time for a break, so I wrote mine down. I hope I can get through it pretty quickly and let y'all have a break. As we've seen over the last several years, American history is being deleted, renamed, and in some cases destroyed. Most of us are fortunate enough in this room that we know 1, 2, maybe even 3 generations back of where we came from. I am a granddaughter of a World War II vet. As most of you know, I was raised by my grandparents. He never, ever spoke of his time in service. But before he died, about 3 months before he passed, he gave me his Army photo album. We were sitting at the kitchen table. He always loved to have his kitchen table right next to the window. So I'm watching him flip through the pages. Sometimes it's a smile, sometimes it's a tear. So I thought, well, the only way I'm going to be able to approach this is to start with the smiles. So I turned the page back. So, Grandpa, who is she? Looks out the window, takes a drag off of his cigarette, a sip of his cup of coffee. Nothing. Does she have a name? Nothing. He never said anything, but he had 6 brothers, and they were all blabbermouths. She was a beautiful young lady whom he liked to visit her family's farmhouse. And one day he didn't make it back on time, and he was AWOL. And almost got thrown in the brig. New question. Okay, look, Grandpa, I know you don't know how to speak German, but I want to know how the two of you communicated. I spoke the language of love. That's all I got. That's all I got. Never told me anything about a senior picture, and as many of you know, in 1973, there was a fire in the Personnel Records Department that wiped out a lot of the World War II service records. I have a friend of mine, her name is Mary Shontag. She is in charge of the POW network. Mary will file and file and file for requests for me on a lot of different things. But when we got my grandfather's records back, I got 2 pieces of paper. That was it. Luckily for me, 1 page was his DD-214. I shouldn't be here. He was at Normandy. There were some things on his DD-214 I didn't understand. And I couldn't, in the world of Google, still couldn't find anything. So y'all remember Paul Andert, if you were here, I think that was the first year we were here in Tulsa, World War II vet. He was a tank commander and had a movie made about him with Brad Pitt. And I remember sitting on the floor, like so many of you have seen me do before, at Paul's feet, and I handed him my grandfather's DD-214, and I said, "What did he do?" Paul laughed. I mean, laughed. He goes, "I can tell you exactly what your grandpa did." Please tell. He said, "From inside the tank, I couldn't tell what was ours and theirs. Your grandfather had the pleasure of walking outside the tank to tell me what was ours and theirs. He had a crappy job." It was more than I knew before. I wish that I had got to take him on an honor flight, because I always thought that maybe he would open up to me at the honor flight. He died before that could happen. Being involved with my Wolfhound family, I know how important the interviews that John and Tim have done are now. But I look back and I wish I had had that from him. What I wouldn't give for a 5-minute interview. Thank you, John. Thank you, Tim. Because there are going to be grandkids and great-grandkids and great-great-grandkids. They're going to be able to look back and know what their grandfather, their granddad, their papa, their peepa did that got them to where they are today. They gave them the freedoms that they have to do what they do. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Got anything? Jerry? You're live.
My father was a World War II Army veteran. He was in the 9th Division. He was in throughout Germany, and all I know is that by the end of the war, they made him an NP. My Uncle Anthony, he was a few years older. He was all over Europe. He was there for D-Day. And 4 Purple Hearts, Distinguished Service Cross. And in 2001, the family was invited to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where they named their new headquarters building Tempesta Hall after my Uncle Anthony was killed 2 weeks before his unit pulled out of Europe.
That's interesting that you say that, because for years in the death notices in the Washington Post, on May 8th of different years, there would be a picture of a pilot, and he was a P-51 pilot. He was killed on May 8th, 1945, and it was put in by somebody in his family. May 8th was the day that Germany surrendered. This man was killed on the last day of the war. And these death notices were in the paper for 20, 30 years, every year on May 8th. And then they stopped, and I realized the people that had been putting them in, they'd passed away too. You're good.
I don't know if any of y'all were at the reunion where Mr. Quintrell embarrassed me and made me cry when he gave me an American flag that was flown at the Iwo Jima Memorial in my father's name. My father was a Marine, and he died a Marine. That's no question about that, a few years back. But all the war movies you've seen about Marines fighting in the Pacific, he was at every one of them, Guadalcanal, Philippines. But the one thing that he even mentioned at all was the fact that he watched the flag being raised at Iwo Jima. And he always said that was the proudest moment of his life when he saw that go up. I, to this day, have no clue how many awards he got as for bravery, but I do know he had 3 Purple Hearts.
Thank you. And by the way, the Army troops under MacArthur and the Marines under Nimitz or Halsey, whoever, I forget the naval guys, that were working their way up through the South Pacific, they were putting troops on these amphibious landings with the anticipation that 9 out of 10 wouldn't get past the beach. They were going to take 90% casualties. So if they figured it'd take 10,000 men to take this island, they'd put 100,000 men on. And this was after battleships had just been firing nonstop for days, softening up the positions. It was just brutal.
When I was a little kid, I remember my grandparents didn't live very far from us, and my mother would take us over there. I think she was visiting her mom, my grandmother. And when we would get to the house and step in the front door, my grandfather would be sitting in a rocker up in the living room, and we'd walk in and he'd look at me and he'd go, "Children are to be seen and not heard. You go over there and sit over there." And as a little kid, you know, I didn't realize what was going on, but I'd go over there and sit, and about 2 minutes later, my grandmother would come out and get me out of there and take me into the kitchen. My grandfather, I never saw him without an old-fashioned on the table next to him. So my grandmother would take me into the kitchen, and she would make me a little Rob Roy with the 7-Up and stuff. And so my mother and her and I would be in the kitchen. And my grandfather never spoke to me, except those words. Children are to be seen but not heard. So I did notice, though, that every once in a while when we'd go over there, there'd be some other man sitting in the front room with my grandfather, and they were talking a blue streak back and forth. I later found out that that was one of his shipmates. And they were talking about what happened in the war. So he was, my grandfather, interesting guy. His father signed him into the Navy when he was 15 years old. The reason he did that is they had 11 kids in the family. He was the oldest. And his dad came to him one day and said, you're old enough to get a job and work, and we can't continue to feed you. And so his dad said, I'm going to take you down to the Navy. You'll have something to eat. You'll have a roof over your head. And so that my grandfather went in, and his first job in the Navy is he repaired sails. The Navy still had sailing ships when he went into the Navy. But he had 35 years. All he knew was the Navy. Chief Warrant Bosun, which is a mean son of a bitch on a ship. Those bosun's mates, brother, boy, they were mean. They had to be, because they were in charge of that ship. And so as I got older, I thought about my grandfather, and I heard stories from my dad and my mom about all the tours where he'd been in the Aleutians and, all over every port, every country my grandfather went to. And of course now I have my aunt, who's 99 years old, sent me a huge box, and it's all my grandfather's stuff. Oh, wow. And it's amazing. I'm just starting to go through it. Unbelievable. So I get drafted. My grandfather calls my mother. I want you to send John over. And I thought, oh man, what am I in trouble for? He had never spoken to me before, but all he ever said is I was supposed to sit in the corner, right? So she says, Grandpa wants to see you before you go to Vietnam. So I went over there, and my grandfather sat with me in the front room, just like he had with his shipmate. And he said, let me tell you something. You're going to see some really bad stuff. And he says, I've just got two things for you. Keep your head down. And he said, and I just hope that you make it. Okay? And so that was it. So I left. And I went to Vietnam, and lucky enough to come home. When I got home, one of the first people that called was my grandfather. He said, come over. I want to talk to you. And I did, and I walked in, and he was a different man. All of a sudden, I was a man to him. He had some respect for me, and that's what it meant. That's what it took. I mean, with these old guys, these old sailors, if they didn't respect you, and he'd earned his respect, and now I earn my respect. So he says, I've got something for you. And he goes in the bedroom and brings out a box. He says, I want you to have my service revolver. And that just meant, I was blown away. And from that day on, my grandfather would call and talk to me, or I'd go over and we'd chat. And I just thought, man, all those years, he'd never speak to me until I was a veteran. And I came home from a war. So God bless him, and quite a guy. His service record, you guys, is absolutely unbelievable. So I'm very proud of him.
Thank you, John.
I just have a couple of things to say. I had my father was 17 in 1945. He went into the Navy, but on inactive duty, waiting to go in. The war came over, so they kicked him out. They didn't need him anymore. I had a step-grandfather who was in the Seabees. He was, I think said he was 37 years old, and he was too old to fight, so he was a mechanic, did the Seabee things. But I had an uncle with an interesting case. He went fought in Okinawa. He would never talk about it. His wife said, he had a lot bottled up inside of him. He would never talk about it. His wife said, I can't get him to talk. His kid would say, he'll never talk. And he never did. He took it to his grave. He just was just so eaten up inside, he couldn't do anything with it.
Thank you.
Hi. Both of my grandfathers served in World War II. My mom's dad was in the Army. We don't know anything about what he did. He did not talk to the family about it at all. We think he was in supplies, but we don't know. And he died before I was born, so I never got a chance to talk with the guy. My dad's dad was World War II also. He was in the Navy. He was in the Pacific Theater, did a lot of aviation, like supply runs and whatnot. His brother served in the European Theater. We think he was in Battle of the Bulge, Bastogne area, but we're not really sure because, like everybody else has said, they don't talk about it. My dad's dad, one time at a holiday, had an extra brandy or something, and he got a little open about it, pulled out a big cardboard box and talked about this picture and this ribbon and stuff, and it was way before we had the technology to record him, because that's the only time he ever talked about it. And my brother, who was too young at the time to remember any of that, and I have been up my dad's backside since my grandpa's passing a couple of years ago to get at that box, because we want to know just, you know, who Grandpa was. And I'm so honored to be here, to hear what you guys did. Thank you.
Thank you. Is anybody else didn't get a chance to talk? And I'll do a little wrap up here. See, I only tripped once. I've gone over 3 or 4 times. Yeah. There are a couple other people I want to mention that I knew, and then one was when I went to work for the Postal Service in 1985, there was a clerk who was a counter clerk, worked up front, sold stamps, very quiet, didn't talk to anybody. But I got talking to him at one point. He was a generation older than I was. He was ready to retire, and found out just amazing things about him. For one thing, he had a combat infantry badge with 3 stars on it. He was Vietnam, Korea, World War II, counting backwards. But what really impressed me is I talked to him and asked him where he was and what he was doing in World War II. And the name of the unit, see if anybody knows this, the 5307th Composite Unit. Does that mean anything to anybody? Didn't mean anything to me. It was commanded by General Frank Merrill. Merrill's Marauders was the name of it. They were fighting in Indochina. They were basically long-range patrols working against the Japanese, trying to blow up roads, interfere with the Japanese. And so Ronnie Smith died of dementia a few years ago, but I'd never forgotten that. My next-door neighbor was a guy named Max McDonald. When I met him, he was already a Navy captain, just about ready to retire. What he had done, he was born in Oklahoma, raised on a ranch. When he was 15 years old, his father was so abusive, he ran away from home, lied about his age, and joined the military. That's something you could do in those days. And he became a pilot and was on the USS Monterey, which was one of the ships that when the keel was laid, it was designed to be a cruiser, but they realized very quickly, almost immediately after Pearl Harbor, that they needed to go to aircraft carriers, that they were the war of the future. And so this had been converted to a carrier. And I met him well after I got back from Vietnam, and he was saying that as of the summer of 1945, they'd had flight crews shot down and people wounded, pilots wounded, but they'd never lost a person on the ship. And they ran into a typhoon that in 3 days killed 300 men on the ship, most of them being washed overboard. The ship was listing so badly so far that seawater, the stacks went underwater, tons of cold seawater rushed down into blew up the boilers, killed everybody in the engineering department. 500-pound bombs were in bomb racks that weren't designed to be operated at a 45-degree angle, and so bombs were rolling across the hangar deck, hitting the struts of the planes and collapsing them. The survivors tied themselves to the arresting cables up on the flight deck, and finally, when the typhoon let up, they were able to fight fires and they pushed every single plane off into the ocean, managed to get up some steam and limp back to Pearl Harbor. But the war was over for them. But when I met him, and I'm hearing this story, and he looks at me and he says, I don't know how you boys in Vietnam managed to do that. And it's funny because I do that with other wars too. I hear some guy talking about Afghanistan or Iraq, and I go, man, I don't know how they did that. And I think it's just something that everybody picks up. Whenever there was an anniversary of an event, I would talk to my male customers who looked like they were of the right age, and I would ask them, where were you 50 years ago today? Where were you 60 years ago today? I was in a medical building, and I held an elevator for an old gentleman who was really struggling to get into the elevator. And elevators move very slowly in medical buildings. In case you didn't know it, they're set that way, and the doors open and close very slowly. And I looked at him, and it was the 60th anniversary of VJ Day, Victory in Japan, basically the end of World War II. And I asked him, I said, where were you 60 years ago today? He said, I was in China. And I said, let me guess, you were with occupation forces that were hustling into China to take over the territory that the Japanese had captured. And he said, no. He said, I'd been in China for a couple of years. He was in western China where they had built a runway in western China because the initial B-29 flights were not off the islands in the Pacific. They hadn't been captured yet. They were flying out of India, landing in western China, refueling, loading up with bombs, and taking off and bombing Japan. And one of the comments that he made was, he said those bombers used every inch of that runway to get off and to head off to Japan. He looked at me and he said, how about you? Were you in the military? And I said, well, yeah, I was in Vietnam. And he said, yeah, I was there. And I said, when were you there? And he said, well, I was there 3 times. I said, 3 times. I said, when was the first time? He said, 1954. I looked at him and I said, where were you? And he said, I was at Dien Bien Phu. He was a U.S. Army Air Force advisor, liaison with the French forces in the fortress at Dien Bien Phu, which is on basically the Laotian North Vietnamese border, where the French were making a last stand and figured they'd be pretty safe because nobody could haul artillery up and into those mountains. And the Viet Minh managed to haul artillery up, and they were just creaming this base. And I said, did you get captured? And he said, no. He said we were ordered out about 3 days before they fell. And I'm thinking, well, you couldn't land a plane there. They were parachuting all the supplies in off the U.S. was. And so what that meant was they would get a group of guys and they would say, okay, tonight when it gets dark, we're going to have some fire start over here and we'll create a diversion. You guys go through the wire here, work your way down that little gully to that tree line, head east to the South China Sea. And about that time we got to his floor and I opened it up and I saw him go into a radiation clinic, and I realized the guy had cancer, and he was pretty old at the time. My father was a draftee, was in the Signal Corps, and put up radar towers in England. And to calibrate the radars, they would stand on the tower, and the British had Spitfire planes that would come right at the tower at 350 knots, and then zoom past them, and then they'd check to see what how the radar was what it had read, because the pilot had a known speed, and they needed to match the two. And he said the British pilots apparently just really loved coming within 50 feet of the tower and waving to the Yanks as they went by, but it was still pretty hair-raising. My mother at the same time was in the Navy. My mother joined the Navy during World War II to get away from her very controlling mother, and that tells you the family dynamics there. But they met at the Naval Research Lab, and during the tail end of the war. And I'll finish with I would, as I told you, I would ask customers, where were you? And this one guy was telling me that he was after the U.S. had captured Rome and pretty much pushed the Germans out of Italy. They'd set up an air base and were bombing in Czechoslovakia and in Austria, and going north. And he said the last day of the war, and this was on VE Day, he said they had B-17s fueled, bomb loaded, and lined up, and they were getting ready to take off on a flight. And they announced the war was over. And he said all of a sudden people started firing off flares like crazy. One of them landed on one of these B-17s, caught it on fire. The pilot had to taxi it off the runway and down a hill. People were jumping out, planes were exploding and on fire, and he said the commander of the base was really, really pissed about this. Anyhow, thank you all for sharing. I think they don't call them the greatest generation for nothing.
That's a lot of history. Holy cow. Well, listen, we're going to break for a couple hours. There was one gentleman that wanted to reach out but wasn't able to connect, and if he answers, we'll say hi to him, and that's Moose.
Hello?
Yeah, is this Moose?
Yeah.
Hey, Moose, you're on with the guys at the Wolfhound reunion. How you doing, man?
Good, and you?
Everybody's awake.
They all still awake?
Yeah.
Been a long day, huh?
Yeah, we've had a good day. Would have been better if you'd have been here.
Well, it's one of those things. I'm just about getting ready to leave for a meeting now. They had a big rally up at the, well, it's going on for 3 days for the 50th anniversary of Vietnam at the Mall of America.
Wow, that's exciting. Well, listen, give us an update on how the family's doing and how your health's doing, buddy.
Oh, everybody's doing fine. I had eye surgery here about 3 months ago, and I was just up for a checkup on Monday. Everything is going good. They pulled some more stitches out, and it's healing the way they expected. Everything is looking good there. Going to ball games, watching the grandkids all the time. We were at a ball game last night, and Avery, the little one that was up on the fishing trip, they won their game last night.
Sounds like you're having a good time, buddy.
Oh, yeah, traveling and running here back and forth to Chicago, and I'm headed up to Canada at the end of the month to go fishing.
Would you adopt me as your son? My dad sucks at doing stuff. He don't want to do nothing anymore.
Well, what the hell's the matter with him?
He's wearing, did he tell you he's starting to wear adult diapers now?
Is he?
Yeah, I'm embarrassed. Will you take me fishing, Daddy Moose, Papa Moose?
Sure. Are you is he wearing those diapers around his neck, or?
What, you know what? That made my whole day. Maybe hearing that you're so involved in your grandkids and kids, maybe my dad now will, maybe he'll just go fishing with me one more time.
Oh, I think you probably would.
He said, Moosey said, don't count on it.
Don't count on it?
I know, right?
What's the deal there?
You know, here, I'll let you say hi to Big John and then.
Is Tommy Clack here?
Tommy couldn't make it. He's on assignment doing some stuff with the government.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I was going to say, if Tommy goes, your old man's got to go.
Yeah, that's right.
Moose meat.
Yes, sir. How you doing, man?
You know what? Better than I ought to be. We just talked the other day.
Yeah.
And I was telling the guys I was hoping that we were going to be able to get you on the phone today. And what words of wisdom do you have for the guys here? We've by the way, we've had a great reunion, and
Good.
I just everybody's asked about you, and of course, you know, it's not the same without you here. But that's, you know, next year's another year, buddy.
That's right. Yep. I just wish everybody well and stay safe and keep on coming to the reunions. If there's one next year, I'll be there.
And then
one way or the other.
Right across the table, Ricochet's sitting right across from me.
Really?
Yeah, what do you want? No, I'm not going fishing.
No, he's not going fishing.
And then
Why is that? Can't take the company or what?
Pretty much. I've been around you enough to know better than know what you're talking about.
So then
Yeah.
I'm looking at the back of the room, Moose, and Bruns is standing back there, but he won't know anything about this conversation because he can't hear a single thing.
Well, and he don't know much about conversations anyway. He never did talk.
He's deafer than Big Joe standing over there by the t-shirts. He's looking good as ever.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, Big Joe. He's looking good.
Did you tell him that?
He's usually standing by a woman someplace.
He is.
And
He is.
listen, she's young and beautiful too, Moose.
Really?
Wouldn't you know it? Seriously.
She must be blind.
Big Joe's going home to get dreadlocks, I guess, on his long hair.
So, and
Really?
then I'm looking across the room here, and there's John Cook over here. Big John boy, he's sitting over there. But Joe is hitting on his daughter, Whitney, and
Really?
it's shameful. No, Moose, it's really embarrassing for all of us.
Well,
And then Dasher,
it was kind of embarrassing to be in Vietnam with Joe, but, you know, we didn't have a choice.
And then Dasher is here again, so he's adding
Well, that's cool.
he's adding a lot of comic relief to the whole reunion. Of course, he showed up.
Did he make a bunch of money?
No, not yet. He's about $150 ahead, and that's it. But but guess what, Moose? He came to this meeting in his pajama top. Can you believe that?
Really?
Oh yeah. Oh sure.
I'll be damned.
And
He hasn't changed much then.
And Chuck Moore's with us again, and Faye.
Hi there, Chuck. And Faye?
And Faye is selling tickets like mad, just like always. You know, it's
Just like always,
Oh
yeah.
yeah. So how's Patty doing?
Good. She's out for a walk right now.
Okay.
She goes on her force march every day almost every day.
Yep.
For about 5 miles, and she's out doing that today because it's been raining here for a couple of days, so she hasn't gotten out.
Yep. Cy Krevling just took us through a session on World War II. We all got a chance to talk about our relatives or people that we knew that were in that war. That was really interesting. So it's just like you're here, buddy. You know, you're getting a recap here, so you should.
I sure appreciate that, guys. If there was any way I could have made it, I would have. I had a VA appointment on Monday and another one down in Albert Lee on Wednesday, and today I thought maybe it would work out so we could get in contact with each other.
Well,
You know what, Moose? You know we love you, man, and you're sorely missed. But like you said, next year's another year, and we'll be getting together.
That's right. We'll do it. You got any idea where or anything set up yet, or?
Yeah, I think we're going to be in a schoolhouse in Owatonna, Minnesota.
That's cool. That's where I'm at right now, sitting on the deck listening to the birds.
So, yeah. But anyway, Moose, I'll let you go, brother. But look, we love you,
right.
and you take care.
Yeah.
And I'm glad your
Hang
eye
in there
is.
and say hi to Sarah and Bob, and
Oh,
thank
yeah.
them again for all they do for us vets.
Yep. And we're glad your
Oh,
eye is
say,
doing better.
Before I forget, I got another little envelope full of donations in behalf of Ernie's family and friends here from Steele County.
Okay. Sounds wonderful, man.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, tell everybody we said hello. Tell Minnie Moose we're thinking about him, okay?
Oh, I'll do that. I'll
Okay,
do that
partner.
too.
Thanks so much for spending time with us, Moose.
Great to hear from you guys, and love you all. And hey, stay safe.
Okay.
Well, I think we tried to reach out to banquets. We were going to back dinner up to 5:30. We haven't heard from her yet, though, so the room will probably be open at 5. Did she